of the week ahead. We have some travel next week. On Tuesday, as we've announced, the President will travel to Dearborn, Michigan to visit the Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center. As Ford has said, they will preview for him the new F-150 Lightning, which will be built by UAW workers. On Wednesday, he will travel to New London, Connecticut, where he will deliver the keynote address at the Coast Guard Academy's 140th commencement exercises. And on Friday, he will welcome His Excellency Moon Jae-in, President of the Republic of Korea, to the White House. President Moon's visit will highlight the ironclad alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea and the broad and deep ties between our governments, people, and economies. Brief update on the Colonial pipeline. With Colonial pipelines, as the President outlined just yesterday, since the shutdown of the Colonial pipeline last Friday, we've had a whole of government response across the administration to help get the pipeline back online and mitigate any supply shortages. As a part of that, last night, the Department of Homeland Security announced a second targeted and temporary Jones Act waiver to give us additional tools to get fuel to affected communities. This follows an initial Jones Act waiver Wednesday night, steps that the Department of Transportation took to ease the transport of fuel overland, and waivers from the EPA that have collectively added the equivalent of 5 million tanks to the affected region's gas supply, in addition to other actions, of course, we've taken across the federal government. With the announcement yesterday that service has been restored to all markets they serve by Colonial Pipeline, we know that supply is returning and that the end is in sight. And the actions that DOT and EPA are taking will speed up the process of getting gas from the pipeline to stations, which is, of course, of great interest to the American people, especially in the impacted regions. And we want to remind the public that it will take a few days to fully return to normal. We urge people in affected regions to only buy the gas they need so that we can help speed up the process. Our current expectation, based on the conversations between the company and experts at the Department of Energy, is that the vast majority of markets in affected regions are receiving fuel at gas stations for consumers and will continue to receive more fuel throughout the weekend and into early next week, hence getting us closer to return us back to normal. With that, Jonathan, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Jen. On infrastructure negotiations,
yes.
You said yesterday that the only red line, a term I know you don't like, for the president was inaction. Previously, the president had pledged that he is not going to raise taxes on any Americans who are making less than $400,000 a year. Is that pledge still a red line, or has that changed?
That is still a red line.
Okay. And as a follow-up to that, would raising fees or increase in the gas tax, which is stuff that is being discussed in negotiations, would that violate that pledge? Can the administration promise that people making less than $400,000 not face an increase in fees?
The president's pledge and his commitment, his line in the sand, his red line, whatever you want to call it, is that he will not raise taxes for people making less than $400,000 a year. User fees that have been proposed out there would violate that.
Okay. And then on a second matter on Israel, the president yesterday said that he had not seen a, quote, significant overreaction in Israel's response. Since then, Israel has increased its rocket strikes and massed troops at the Gaza border. What, in the president's estimation, would be an overreaction?
Well, look, let me first say that our objective from this administration, from the president, from our entire national security team, is to work toward de-escalation, to work toward a lasting peace. And that is what the focus of every conversation we are having, from the level of the president on down, and many conversations that are happening with people, with leaders in the region, Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, Egyptians, Tunisians, many who can be influential on Hamas. So obviously we are watching this closely. We will remain closely engaged. A lot of conversations we have may happen behind the scenes because that may be the most appropriate way to de-escalate the situation on the ground.
Just to follow up, to pin you down. So what the president has seen so far from Israel, still he believes is not a significant overreaction.
Again, I think the president believes that Israel has a right to self-defense. Obviously, just if we take a step back and remove ourselves for a moment, which I know is hard to do, from the politics, clearly what's happening on the ground, the loss of life, the loss of children's lives, the loss of family members' lives, whether it's Palestinian lives or Israeli lives, is incredibly tragic. It's horrific to watch. that is certainly why our focus is on de-escalating what is happening on the ground. That's our human reaction to what we're seeing. What we're also focused on, the president, many people on our team have been working on issues in the Middle East for decades. And what we also know is that sometimes these conversations need to happen privately in order to have an effective outcome. And that's what our focus is on. Go ahead, Trevor.
Just to follow up on that point, do you feel that Israel is acting with sufficient restraint at this point?
Again, as the president conveyed in his statement, Israel has the right to self-defense. Our focus remains on continuing to use every lever at our disposal to de-escalate the situation on the ground. I think it's also important to remind people Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas does not represent the views, the families, the people who are suffering, all of the Palestinian people who are suffering as a result of this violence. But there's no justification for 1,500 rockets coming from Hamas into Israeli communities in Israel either.
And do you welcome their participation in forthcoming elections, Palestinian elections?
Hamas?
Yes.
Look, I will say that our focus right now is on using our relationships in the region, our deep relationships in the region, again, with the Egyptians, the Tunisians, others who have greater influence with Hamas than certainly we do, and certainly others in the region do, to de-escalate the circumstances and the situation on the ground. That's what our focus is on at this moment in time. Go ahead.
Jen, what is the CDC's new guidance on masking mean for the president's executive order mandating masks on federal property? Is he going to be rescinding that?
Well, again, I think the CDC guidelines were just put out, as you all know, yesterday. They were decided by what they were going to be, what the specifics were, but also the timeline by the CDC, not by us, not by the White House, not by the president, to be very clear. And we're working to implement those across the government. As you've seen yesterday, as soon as the guidelines came out, we got a note that came across our emails that said, you don't need to wear masks here anymore. We talked to the White House Correspondents Association immediately and said, reporters don't need to wear masks anymore unless they choose to. Same for the American people, of course. So we're working to implement. It may take a couple of days, but certainly I would expect on federal lands, federal properties, that the guidelines will be the guide.
Got it. Republican senators said that yesterday's infrastructure meeting was productive and it was cordial. So what are the next steps here? What have they agreed to do and by when? And is there a follow-up meeting scheduled at this point?
Well, we agree. And I saw the president after the meetings yesterday, and you heard him talk about the meetings, of course, when he gave his remarks about the masks, and he agrees. They were constructive, they were productive. We expect a counter proposal back early next week by Tuesday, is I think what they've committed to as well publicly. There will be discussions at a staff level, at a member level, from members of the White House team over the coming days, as I think most of you would anticipate, and then we'll be in touch from there. So I don't have any next meetings to preview for you, but we will be. We have already been in touch with members. We've already been in touch with their teams. That will continue. Again, we expect the next piece to be a counter proposal by Tuesday.
And who's running point on this from the White House?
Well, it's an across the White House effort, Nancy, as you know. There are a number of officials involved, depending on what the needs are, frankly, from members or staff. So, of course, there are high-level members of the team, everyone from Ron Klain to Steve Ricchetti, Louisa Terrell, Rima Doden, Chris Levin, I could keep naming names, who have conversations all day long with members on the Hill, with their staffs about what follow-up questions they have, what's next in the process, where there's opportunity for agreement, where there are technical questions. Those are happening all the time. But, ultimately, there will also continue to be conversations at the level of the president and members of the Republican leadership and Republican committee chairs, as well as with Democratic leaders as well.
And then can I get your reaction to this report about unaccompanied minors being held in park buses overnight? There was one child reportedly held for 4 days before being reunited with his family. What's the administration doing now about this case? And when you say that you're going to ensure that those responsible are held accountable, what does accountability look like in this case?
Well, first, let me say that the reports of children that you referenced being held in buses outside of HHS of the HHS facility in Dallas for extended periods of time are outrageous, they're unacceptable, and they do not meet our standard for childcare. That is true for the President, it is true for the Secretary of Homeland Health and Human Services, it is true for everyone involved across government. It's being fully investigated, how we got to this point, how this possibly happened. There's no excuse for this kind of treatment in terms of what the consequences will be. I just can't predict that before an investigation is concluded.
Go ahead.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions about the timing of the CDC's announcement yesterday. So did somebody at the Biden administration or in the Biden administration update this guidance for political reasons?
No.
So what was the medical or scientific reason? What was the big breakthrough to do this yesterday?
Well, I know that Dr. Walensky did an extensive number of interviews yesterday to answer exactly that question. But as we've talked in here quite a bit about, the CDC, not just Dr. Walensky, but her entire team of health and medical experts are constantly reviewing the data to ensure that they can provide accurate and up-to-date guidance to the American people. So based on 3 factors, as she talked about yesterday, vaccines work in the real world. We've seen a lot of studies done on that, including internally in the federal government. Vaccines stand up to the variants, which at various times has been a concern about the need to continue to mask even after you're vaccinated. And vaccinated people are less likely to transmit the virus. That's how they came to the decision. And that's what she conveyed yesterday when she announced the decision.
But just looking at the CDC's website on the way up here, only 45.6% of U.S. adults have been fully vaccinated as of yesterday. Only 58.9% of the adult population has at least 1 dose. So what happened to President Biden saying in March that he thought lifting mask mandates before every adult American goes and gets a shot is Neanderthal thinking?
Well, first, let me say that the President, our North Star, has been listening to the guidance of our health and medical experts and teams, and that's exactly what we're doing in this case. And just to reiterate, the CDC, the doctors and medical experts there, were the ones who determined what this guidance would be based on their own data and what the timeline would be. That was not a decision made by the White House. It was the White House was informed of that decision, just to give people assurance of that.
So does the president still think that these red state governors who were a little bit ahead of the federal government in lifting the mask mandates had Neanderthal thinking?
Well, again, I would say that even with this guidance that's out there, the guidance is not telling states and localities exactly how they should implement. As you know, there are some localities and states in the country that have higher rates of vaccination than others. Some communities that have higher rates of vaccinations than others. And we even know as this is being implemented that different localities, businesses will implement it in the way that they feel will help ensure their community is safe. But I know I am reassured by listening to the guidance of health and medical experts, not political decision making. So that's the point we're at now.
And my last one, Andy Slavitt said this morning that the White House found out the mask guidance was going to change at 9 p.m. the night before. Were you guys surprised that in the 9 o'clock hour at 9:25, the CDC director was on CNN saying that the science wasn't there yet?
I didn't watch that interview. I can just tell you that a small number of we were informed the night before that the guidance, that they'd made a decision about the guidance. They planned to announce it the next day. And even here, only a small number of people knew that announcement was going to be made. Hence, if you were here yesterday, you saw kind of shock of people taking off their masks around the building. But, it may have been at the point where they were not ready to make the announcement yet, but I point you to the CDC on their specific rollout plan. Go ahead.
Are you guys engaged in any discussions about changing the federal transportation mask mandate at this point?
Well, first I would say we're continuing to review, our health and medical experts are continuing to review the applicability and what is safe to do based on this guidelines, based on their new data. But I don't have anything to preview for you on that front. We'll continue to look to them for guidance on what is safe on an airplane or a train or anything like that.
You talked a lot about this a couple months ago, but now that we're kind of in a new place, is the decision not to pursue a federal vaccine passport policy, is that science-based? Is that you're aware of the political dynamics here? What kind of drove the decision behind that, and is there any change to that decision now that we're in a different place?
Sure. There's no change to it. We are not currently considering federal mandates. We are instead focused on ensuring all Americans understand the benefits of vaccination, that we're answering their questions, and that they have access to get vaccinated. We also understand that private sector companies may decide that they want to have requirements. That's up to them to make that determination. If you are running a stadium, if you are a sports team or something like that, you have different considerations. We fully respect that, but we have no plans to change our approach from the federal government.
And last one, just kind of looking back, it's been a bit of an interesting week overall.
It has been?
A little bit. Is there ever concern, and I understand that this is the deal when you're the President of the United States, but you guys have spent the first 100+ days really laser focused on vaccines and economic aid, that things like the reality of being president takes the focus off your agenda at a pretty crucial time legislatively?
So the president's view is that this is exactly what he was elected to do, is to lead the country during a time of multiple crises. And he came into office, of course, facing both a historic pandemic and 10 million people out of work. He was already facing dual crises when he came in. But his view is that this is what the American people elected him to do. This is why he put together the team he put together, to be prepared in these moments. And this is, the American people elected him to be prepared for whatever comes his way.